I'm often asked, so this is all very fascinating about the hemispheres and your analysis of how we got to be where we are, but it's pretty important, isn't it? What are we going to do about it? I think people can easily become overwhelmed by the thought of the scale of, for example, the ecological crisis that threatens. But almost the most hopeful thing of all is you can begin in the inner temple, which is you. You can begin with the one thing that you do have control over, which is what you do, how you think, what you value. And that can be done here and now and doesn't involve persuading other people necessarily. If we start to ensure that at least we are aligning our own lives with the things that are deep and important, then a lot of things will follow instinctively, and they won't need to be formulated in the way that people want me to formulate them. Well, what we should do is we should, change the curriculum, and we should. Those things are important, but once you begin to see the world differently, you begin to act differently, to prioritize things differently, and different things follow effortlessly because it is a stream. It's a stream that is currently blocked in us, and a stream that can become unblocked.
Okay, Iain, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Niall. It's nice to be back with you.
To set the stage here, can you give us your basic understanding of what consciousness is and how you define it?
Well, there are a couple of interesting assumptions behind your question. One is that it would be a good idea if I defined consciousness at the outset of our quest towards what it is. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily a valid premise. And it's also a very difficult thing, as I'm not the only person to have pointed out, to describe what it is, because it is the thing that enables us to think or have opinions or see anything or do anything at all. So it's a bit like asking a fish to describe what is meant by water. All one ends up doing, I think, is by substituting one word for another. And that's not surprising because there is nowhere to go, as it were, to repackage the idea of consciousness using terms derived downstream from consciousness, and there's nothing upstream from consciousness. So one ends up going sideways to a word like experience. And the experiential is an important category. I think what's quite nice about experience is that it includes everything that one experiences. This is the trouble. One becomes tautological. The trouble, of course, with consciousness is one immediately gets into, so what exactly do I mean by consciousness? Not ultimately, but in the sense of, do I mean consciousness as what is lost in a corpse, or consciousness as what is lost on the operating table in an anesthetized patient, or consciousness as the thing that makes me aware of the focus of what I'm talking about now, rather than other things in my field of consciousness of which I'm not currently aware. So that's the trouble with consciousness, is you have to start peeling away, which one am I talking about? And of course, I think the thing is that what we're talking about is everything that comes to us in experience.
Yes. And when I've heard you talk about this in the past, I've heard you use the metaphor of a stage and a spotlight, and I find this very helpful. Can you maybe just explain that?
Yes. The reason I use that metaphor is that, as you know, and I won't go into the whole hemisphere story, but as you know, one of the foundational differences between the hemispheres is the way they attend to the world. So that the left hemisphere attends to things already known, already desired, in order quickly to grab them, get them, and use them. And for this, it requires a narrow beamed, highly focused attention to a detail in order to get it. And whatever is in that focus is very present, if you like. Although the word present needs to be qualified, but let me just finish this before we go there. And the right hemisphere is taking in everything else, while the left hemisphere is focused on this task of getting something, food or a tool or something to build shelter or whatever it might be. And I sometimes say that the right hemisphere is the one that understands the world, whereas the left really helps us manipulate it, and that's about all. So if you think of the world as having a spotlight of attention that goes from one thing that one's concerned about to the next thing that catches one's attention, as we say, and the next thing that we're concerned about, we don't imagine that on a stage that everything else has disappeared just because at the moment the spotlight's only on one person. The rest of the whole thing is still there. And I think that's why I want to suggest it's a useful metaphor, because sometimes I think people have this idea of the conscious and unconscious as rather like, a beautifully lit room in an 18th century house, which is consciousness. And then underneath, there's some ghastly cellar in which heaven knows what's going on. There may be flooding, there may be spiders, and one wouldn't want to go there. So, but rather than that, what I want to suggest is that actually very little of everything we experience is consciously present to the mind at any moment. And I sometimes quote this, I think rather absurd, but nonetheless entertaining statistic that 99.44% of everything that we are potentially aware of is something of which we are fully conscious.
It makes me think that maybe a better name for the unconscious could be something like the superconscious. Like it seems like it's a bit of a misnomer to call it unconscious.
Yes, I like that. I think that's right. And consciousness is just a very special subset of that realm of the superconscious, in which things are collapsed into relative certainty for a moment.
Now, I'm curious to ask, Iain, what are your thoughts on idealism? Where do you see the limitations in that view on consciousness?
Well, as you know, the word idealism is used slightly differently by different people who would nonetheless call themselves idealists. I'm not sure many people are Berkeleyan idealists in the sense that if something is not perceived, it ceases to exist. I mean, of course, Berkeley's answer to that was that all these things were constantly perceived by God, and that therefore their continued existence was somehow underwritten by that. I certainly wouldn't hold that position, and I think there's an unfortunate tendency. I don't say that everybody falls into it at all, but there's a tendency to want to collapse things into a rather simple mode that, well, it's all just there, out there somewhere, and we are recording apparatus that's to pick up signals and work out what they are. And that's a sort of naive realism, which is espoused still by many scientists, although I think the advent of advances in physics in the first few decades of the 20th century has made that a less tenable position. But I'm not happy at all with an idealist position that says, since we have something to do with the being of whatever is, it's something we create. And it doesn't have to fall into one of these two poles. A lot of what I argue in The Matter with Things is that there is a tendency for the left hemisphere, which, as you know, I think is dominant in our culture, to want to get ambiguities cleared up and to want to go to one or other of two fairly simple poles, black or white. And I would say that nothing really ultimately is properly understood by adopting this very hard dipolar view, and that it's usually a matter of finding a place within that spectrum. But it's not just a sort of midpoint. So, for example, there are, you know that I am enormously fond of and esteem very highly the philosophy of Heraclitus. And a very important part of that is the idea that a thing and its opposite may well be true. This is something that Niels Bohr, commented on early in the 20th century. And he said, of course, in the everyday world, there's no problem that a thing and its opposite are rarely true at the same time. For example, either I did or I didn't have milk in my coffee this morning. There's no two ways about it. But when you come to the really deep and big things, then often a thing and its opposite may be true, but not in the sense of producing a sort of flabby compromise, but that both these opposing entities need to be held at the same time without letting go of either of them. So there's a sort of life-giving tension that comes out of the holding of the two opposites. And the image that Heraclitus gives, and I think is still a very good one, is that of either the string of the bow, which lets fly the arrow, or the string of a lyre, like a harp, where the tension is what gives rise to the music, and in the bow what lets the arrow fly. Without that tension, there's no music, there's no chase, there's no arrow. So it's that kind of thing. And what I'd like to say is I don't think that it's just a wishy-washy compromise between its being out there and being in here, but there is something very definite that comes into being every time a conscious being has experience. And part of what that is it's an encounter. And in an encounter, you can't just get rid of either party. And the encounter can't be just said to be some awful compromise between the two parties. It is actually a coming together that creates something new. And so I believe that the world that we experience is this coming together, the tension between the holding true of my consciousness, as it were, or your consciousness, and whatever it is that is outside of that consciousness. And it's through that approximation, that coming together, that almost like a dance, out of which something new evolves. It's certainly never static. It's certainly never passive.
If this is an encounter, that begs the question, what is the right way to interact with this world? How do we interact with this world in a way that leads to as much flourishing as possible, both individually and collectively?
I'm not sure exactly under what circumstances you mean. Could you rephrase that for me?
So if we're saying that consciousness, it's a co-creative experience, it's an encounter between
Yes.
An agent and the world, and that helps to bring about being.
Yes.
My question is, what is the right way to interact? What is the right way how can we interact with this world in such a way that leads to flourishing as opposed to anything else?
What a very good question. Oh goodness, suddenly I feel there's so many things I'd like to say. Yes, co-creating. So both of them in some sense are coming into being at the same time. So I am becoming who I am through my experiences, but also the world is coming to be what it is through the encounter with me, and obviously with every other encounter with every other conscious being. And to say, how do we do this, is partly, there's one very simple thing to say. And here I'm reflecting on a book I have more than once adverted to, which I think extremely good, called Interdependence by Kriti Sharma, who's an American molecular biologist. And the point she makes about a being and its environment is that if we imagine that the being a living organism, an animal or an animalcule, whatever it is, interacts with the environment. Some people see the environment as passive, and this creature creates the environment. Some people see the creature as created by the environment. But the reality is that it is neither one nor the other. But this is her brilliant insight, I think, that it doesn't happen by a kind of temporal sequence of exchange. First, the animal affects the environment. Then, in response, the environment affects the animal. What she is, I think, beautifully illuminating is that the animal and the environment are effectively locked in a co-creation in which each is giving rise to the other. Now, that is a very concrete instance of something that I believe also exists at a more metaphysical level, which is, I think, that the world, which is in a sense our environment, becomes what it is through our interactions with it. And when I say our, I mean largely living beings, and I mean especially human living beings. Now, let me just sort of step back a couple of paces and say why I'm going there. It is a very good question, not only why there should be anything at all, which is a foundational question in philosophy, and I begin the last chapter of The Matter with Things by saying that this question, why there should be anything rather than nothing, is essentially the big mystery. But a further question, and a much more approachable question, perhaps, is why there should be life. It may seem obvious to us as living beings why there should be life, but as A.N. Whitehead, of whose philosophy I'm a great admirer, and who also saw the ground of being in the cosmos and the cosmos in an act of eternal co-creation. What Whitehead asked was, what is the point of life? Why should there be life? Now, on the face of it, life is a bit counterintuitive. Firstly, it is enormously expensive in terms of energy. Secondly, it has not to sort of disprove the second law of thermodynamics, but for a while, certainly to buck the trend of the second law of thermodynamics, that everything is running down into less complex structures. So it's doing two rather complex things. And if you say, well, maybe it's because of this need to compete for space and persistence of being. And his point is that if you want persistence of being, the great trick is never to have been alive, because a rock can last for billions of years, but once you're alive, you're only going to have a certain lifespan. Now, let's just think about those lifespans from the earliest parts of evolution through to ourselves. There are bacteria in the base of the ocean, actinobacteria, single examples of which may be 1 million years old. So they really win hands down if the business of life is all about being enabled to carry on existing. But it seems to me that it's about a lot more. It's about developing complexity. It's about developing beauty. It's about enhancing what we mean by vitality. And that all these things are costly, but worthwhile from a point of view of the drive that is in the cosmos. And that is that drive of which we are manifestations for a while. And what I think we are called to do is to help further take part in this, if you like, dance or co-creative process between the ground of being, whatever one likes to call it, the ontological primitive, God, or at least the Godhead. It's to take part in that and to further its drive towards complexity and the values that go with it. So I see the values, the ultimate values, as being those of goodness, beauty, and truth, the Platonic virtues. And we've rather lost sight of this in recent times. I mean, more than a little, I would say. Probably never in human history has beauty been so neglected and travestied. and truth trampled on, and goodness reduced to the following of rules, which is almost antithetical to its nature, which is to have a good disposition that goes well beyond rules or calculation. So it is to take part in the generation of those values. And it's with that in mind that we can redirect our life. If I'm right, of course, and there's no way of proving that I'm right, but there's no way of proving I'm wrong either. At this level, we have to make the sense we can, because science starts from the standpoint that it's not going to deal with purpose or value. So it can't answer questions about purpose and value. It doesn't mean to say there are no purposes or values. That's the non sequitur that a lot of people go for. They ask science the answer to the questions whether there's purpose or value. And science, perfectly correctly and admirably, says, but one of the axioms from which I start is that I'm not going to deal in those questions. I'm going to, as far as possible, take them out of the business of understanding. Of course, in the process, what you do is take the human out of the understanding, and understanding is nothing if it's not human. So although science is enormously valuable, it can't deal with certain kinds of issues, but that doesn't mean that they're not very real. And I think that physicists will also support the idea that the cosmos seems to have a direction. It seems to be furthering certain kinds of things. It starts very simple and confined and develops more and more complex structures. And life does something similar. It starts very simple, although simple in terms of life is already enormously complex, but then grows through various, through the tree of life, as it were, to beings such as ourselves, who are not the only ones to be able to appreciate beauty or goodness or truth, but the ones who can most readily respond to them, reverberate with them, encounter them, and help them grow.
Wow. Okay. There's so much in there. One of the things that really jumps out at me is this idea of values potentially being inherent in being itself. That if there are values inherent in me, truth, beauty, goodness, and all the rest, and I come out of this world, then the world itself contains these things as a reality, and then does that then imply that if we can sort of align ourselves with these values and various different virtues, that then we interact with the world in a more beneficial way, in a way that leads to flourishing?
I absolutely do mean precisely that. I think that, people often ask, in an era in which we feel lost, unfulfilled, uncertain, rudderless, how do we find human fulfillment? And I think it is precisely through seeking to engage with these values that are given to us in life. Now, I need to make an important distinction, because some people may say, oh, but values are what we make them up to be. I can show you a tribe somewhere who think that it's perfectly okay to have sex with children, and in our society we don't think this is good, and so forth. Well, that may be true, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the ways in which what is good may be locally interpreted. I'm talking about the fact that there is good. There is, in all societies we know, there is the idea of what is good and what is bad. And in fact, those who are relativists exaggerate the differences. I mean, I've probably just enormously exaggerated by positing that there is any tribe in which this goes on, but you never know. But the same with beauty. People say, oh, well, ideals of beauty change. This is true, they do. But on the other hand, there is enormous agreement across an astonishing array. So, for example, I've just been in Japan, where for thousands of years they developed an aesthetic that had nothing to do with the aesthetic of the modern West. And yet, immediately, and I don't think I'm alone in this, I think any visitor to Japan will be ravished by the beauty that is there. It's not beauty according to exactly the same way of thinking that ours is, but it is beauty we immediately recognize. And Japanese and Chinese tourists and Indian tourists and tourists from other parts of the world coming to London and going around the National Gallery or going to Stratford-upon-Avon to listen to Shakespeare, they don't say, oh, I don't know what all this is about. I can't understand why they think this is great. They are also immediately struck by the power of the art of another culture. So I just wanted to make that clear, because I don't want any misunderstanding about what I'm saying when I say values are not relative. That kind of small differences are relative, but they're not made up by us. So whether we respond to good, to beauty, to truth is up to us. We can neglect it, we can travesty it, in which case I would consider that our lives have been entirely wasted, or we can aim to further them. And I think, largely speaking, that has been a way of thinking that has been present in many wisdom traditions, but also even outside of any obviously spiritual tradition. People have thought in general that making things that are beautiful, encouraging the flourishing of something beautiful, is better than making something ugly. And I was very struck by the fact that I saw works of art from Korea when I was in Japan that were thousands of years old. So in a time that would be considered almost prehistoric, and certainly fairly early, but they were intricate and beautiful. And it's an observation that was made in the history of the world in 100 objects, which based on artifacts in the British Museum, that the earliest artifacts are already made beautiful, not just functional. So even if their function is to act as a knife, then that knife has to be made beautiful as well as just functional. So even when people have barely covered the basics of what they need for life, beauty calls to them. And I'd just like to mention in this regard that, and you'll be aware of this from what I've written, but it is very striking that in the descent of man, that Darwin refers to beauty very, very often. He refers to beauty throughout all his work, but in The Descent of Man, he uses the word beauty or beautiful on average every other page. And he twice stops and says, but why is there beauty at all? And he has no answer to that. And what he's drawing attention to, and people don't necessarily think of this initially, is that although given beauty, you can say, oh, well, evolutionary uses it to help choose mates and so on. But that's saying given beauty. But Darwin's question is, why should anything be more beautiful than anything else? Why should a color be beautiful? Why should a form be beautiful? Why should a sound be beautiful or not?
Yeah, this is fascinating. And I think, to me, that's a very hopeful message, to know that there are these things that are objectively real, that if I can align myself with, it's going to lead to a better quality of life. To me, that is a very liberating truth to understand,
I'm glad, because I believe it to be so. I think it's a terribly important message, actually, to get across.
Now, there will be somebody listening to this that's a skeptic. And how would you respond to them? How would you respond to someone who argues it doesn't, like, it's all meaningless, nothing really matters? Like, how do you respond to someone at the extreme end of the spectrum that believes that it's all just random chance and there's no inherent order or beauty in the cosmos?
Well, in this area, as I've already said, we're not in an area of proof. I can't prove that there is meaning or value to somebody who doesn't see it. They can't prove to me that it's worthless and valueless, especially as I experience it as the opposite. And so do most people, I think, if they allow themselves. Now, the thing is, that idea of allowing oneself is very important, because if you build around yourself a carapace of what might be called skeptical thought, but I think is better described as cynicism, actually. Because I'm a skeptic of skepticism as well, and I'm certainly a skeptic of cynicism. But, I'm a skeptic of most theories and arguments, including my own. So I think that's a valuable thing. But the end of skepticism is not to end up in a position that you feel you've destroyed everything, but rather that you've cleared the field of things that are getting in the way. And one of the things that may be getting in the way is the very certainty that such a person might have, that there is no value and there is no meaning. And in a way, it falls into a category of pretty much all the important matters of experience, that you have to put yourself in the way of them in order to have a chance to understand them. So, I mean, somebody might say, I would like to meet a partner and get married. And that's fine. And they can't make it happen. However, they can make it not happen. And they can make it not happen by cutting themselves off from society, living in a cocoon, making sure that they never do meet people. Because, the minimum requirement for being able to experience the excitement of being in love with somebody is actually to meet somebody. Now, that might not be a perfect analogy, but I think there's an important truth in it for the person who says, I don't see anything here. I think that I would like them to ask themselves the question, so do you think that is because there is nothing there? Or do you think it's something to do with you, something to do with your sight, something to do with the way in which you look at the world? And it's perfectly possible to look at it one way. I mean, this is essential to my argument that the two hemispheres look at the world in different ways. One of them is stuff to exploit, and its only value is use, and that is the left hemisphere. And the right hemisphere as something that is alive and intrinsically worth something. And in that worth comes a lot of the things that I have been talking about. Goodness, beauty, and truth, for example.
So what do you think are the root causes that are driving many of the crises that are facing us in the modern world? What do you think's at the core of this? That includes the meaning crisis, the environmental crisis.
Well, there are many ways of answering that, but one that you would expect, I think, from me, is that I think I can demonstrate very clearly that the less understanding of our two hemispheres has come to dominate dialogue and our way of living in the world, and is drowning out the still there to be listened to right hemisphere, which is more intelligent, literally, than the left hemisphere. It's more intelligent in IQ terms, let me state that. It's also very much more intelligent in emotional and social terms. It attends to more, it perceives more of what it attends to, it makes much better judgments on the basis of what it receives through attention and perception. And the result of us being hijacked by a desire to follow the left hemisphere's dictates is that we have lost track of what gives value to life. The left hemisphere's value, and see, this is where values are incredibly important. And it might interest you and listeners to know that this is definitely something that I discovered in the writing of The Matter with Things. I mean, all my life I thought values were important in a sort of general kind of a way. But I hadn't realized when I started to write the book that when I came to the last part of The Matter with Things, which is metaphysics or ontology, what is there? What can we say at all about the cosmos in which we exist? And who we might be and what we're doing here. I knew that I would have chapters on space and time and matter and consciousness, but I didn't know I would have chapters on values per se and on purpose per se, as well as the sense of the sacred. I kind of knew I would come to the sense of the sacred, but it seems to me obvious that that is bound up now with direction and with value. But it's not so bound up with them that they can't be seen separately. And values are important because the guiding values are what dictate what we see, what we make of what we see, and which path we follow. So that if we're of the view that having power to manipulate things in the world so that we can make things the way we would like them is the key to happiness, fulfillment, and wisdom, then obviously we prioritize the things we do prioritize. In other words, ransacking nature for material that can be used to build complicated machines and so forth. And we also tend, it's a natural function of this me self-directed business of acquiring power and comfort and pleasure for oneself, that we become atomistic and selfish and greedy. And it's also part of this way of thinking that, for reasons that unless you particularly want to go there, we can make an excursus there, but I'll just say it for now. It's all laid out in The Sense of the Sacred, which is a very long chapter. But it's quite clear that the left hemisphere doesn't have the capacity to understand what is meant by the sacred or the divine or whatever you like to call it. So you can't really expect it to get it. Now, if you look at what I'm saying, you see there an alienation from society, from others, from the idea that we're not just atomistic, but are intrinsically social beings who derive who we are from society, from family, from school, from university, from colleagues, from friends, from the relations of every day. And that it's our duty not just to take from it, but to help it flourish and to give back to it. Not necessarily to have some wild theory about what will make it a lot better and make us all a lot better, because history shows that people who had these ideas have a very poor track record and usually ended up creating more human misery than anybody else. So there's that, the alienation from the human, and indeed a revulsion against the human, which I now find I see everywhere, that people feel they could put more trust in a machine than in a person, attacks on the human body and its limitations, attacks on nature, in fact. And that takes me to the second thing, which we know is incredibly important for human flourishing. The first is belonging to a social group in which one has a sense of trust and which coheres. And there's a huge body of literature about this. It's absolutely incontroversial that when you actually belong to such a social group, you flourish, your mental health is better, your physical health is better, to such an extent that such flourishing is at least as good in terms of avoiding cardiovascular disease, for example, as stopping smoking and going to the gym 3 times a week. But that's not really my focus. I'm not particularly interested in that. I just say it because for those who are interested in, well, I think it all boils down to material, then it's actually better for that as well. So also is closeness to nature. And I don't just mean, although that comes into it, physical proximity to nature, but also having an attentive relation to nature, not importing our own chatter into nature, but spending time silently in nature, meditating, looking at what is there, attending and noticing its beauty and complexity and capacity to inspire wonder and awe. And the third is the relationship to the divine or the sacred. which we think we know better than, that only sort of foolish or primitive people think things like that. Well, I would argue that only a foolish or primitive person would dismiss the idea of there being anything in this conception of the divine. I'm not saying that people who are atheists are in any way stupid people or bad people. I don't think that's necessarily the case at all. But all I'm really saying is that I do think that it's pretty stupid, or if you look at all the evidence, to reflect that there can be nothing in this. So I think when you put those things together, that we're driven by a desire for things that the left hemisphere dictates, that they involve us in cutting ourselves off from the grounds of human fulfillment, which are the three things that I mentioned: society, nature, and God. It's not surprising that we have the crisis we have. And I think it's made worse by the way in which we now confuse the young by telling them things that I think are damaging, that they shouldn't imagine that they are born as boys or girls and can enjoy becoming boys and girls and be proud of being boys and girls. That we've now attacked males so successfully that a lot of males don't even feel that they know how to date a member of the opposite sex, that it will result in them being, their lives being destroyed, and that they're not worth anything, or they don't even go to university now. Lots and lots of them are drifting away from it. I mean, this is a tragedy because they're at least as intelligent as women. So, I mean, if you put all these things together, you can imagine that people are completely confused about what it is that they should be doing. And I'm not saying that what they should be doing is all going to university. In fact, I think it would be a very good idea if most people that currently do go to university did something else first, perhaps for several years before they decided, I really want to go to university. And if there were few enough of them and they passed that bar, we could afford to fund their education at universities so they didn't have a lot of income.
For sure. A lot of wisdom in there. Something that really jumps out at me from your work as particularly important, and correct me if I go wrong here, but this idea that, the two different hemispheres have two very different ways of interacting with the world. The left obviously seeks to grasp and narrowly focus on things, and it's all about acquiring. And then the right is more holistic. It's all around understanding, seeing the bigger picture, everything else as well. So we can, and this might be a stretch, so correct me if I'm wrong, but can we almost say that how we attend to the world, I want to really underline how there, how we attend to the world influences which hemisphere becomes predominant. If I interact with the world in a more patient, peaceful, holistic way and sort of see the bigger picture, my right hemisphere is more likely to come online than if I'm sort of rushing through, like narrowly focused on, getting things and all the rest. Does that make sense, or is that too much of a stretch?
Not at all. It makes perfect sense, and indeed, it's partly that when we develop a society which is somewhat overstretched in terms of its size and its reach, we're involved in the process of controlling it, administrating it, and so forth, which requires people to work in a very left hemispheric way according to rules and procedures and so forth. And that our education has too much emphasized matters that are, at least at the school level, highly procedural. So things like how to do certain kinds of scientific experiments, how to calculate and think about calculation. These are very important. The difficulty I always have is that when I'm saying something, I'm always thinking, oh, but somebody will think I'm saying without the opposite. So, I should already qualify that when I say I think it's very confusing for young people, and I stand by it, to be told that they should think that they might be almost anything that they want to make up, rather than what they appear to be and would always have been taken to be. I'm certainly not being in any way disrespectful to the rather small group of people, but who are a very real group of people who require help and understanding in a process of living a life as a member of the opposite sex. And as a psychiatrist, I have helped a couple of people to do that. So I just thought I'd mention that. But when I say there's too much emphasis on STEM subjects, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have these subjects. Of course, they should be there, but they should take their place alongside other more complex subjects. And what do I mean by complex? Well, I mean things that can't simply be explained by following procedures and rules. So they are things like attending to a play of Shakespeare, poetry, the culture of ancient Greek, all sorts of things that used to history, all sorts of things that used to be part of what we call the humanities, and indeed help us to appreciate and understand what a human being is. The key is in the name. And so I think that once we start approaching life in a very proceduralizing way, this is how you get a good grade at A level. This is how you get into university. These are the things you should study. Then we are automatically jumping the gun in a way. We're not allowing people to have enough time to open their minds to the full spread of experience. And I just want to emphasize this, that I can say from my own experience that the fact that I never had to close down my thinking to specifics at too early a stage was what enabled me to, if you like, to carry on assimilating knowledge from different spheres of scholarship and seeing the patterns and the meanings that come out of the bringing together of them. Because I think it's out of the bringing together of things, of people, of ourselves with the full extraordinary extent of the natural world, and of ourselves with the sacred in the cosmos, that meaning arises, and we start seeing for the first time that is what makes sense. That is the shape of things. Now, unless you have put yourself in the way of experiencing this, I simply can't explain it to you. And, I sometimes use the example of being in love. And it's very, very real love. But I can't explain to somebody who says, I don't know what this is, this love you talk about. I don't think it really exists. I can't say, well, I can tell you it does exist, and a lot of other people will tell you that too, but I can't persuade you of that, and I can't describe it to you. You have to actually experience it. Now, when I said this to Alex, is he Alex Connor or Alex O'Connor? He's a very bright young podcaster who I think tends to have an audience of fairly reductionist materialists. And when I said this, oh, he's invoking the God of the gaps and all this kind of, this is why I feel like unless I wad everything I say around with, and there isn't time in an interview, no, I'm not invoking a God of the gaps. I'm not saying I believe in God because you can't explain, you can't measure love. I'm just saying, I'm using it to say there are things that unless you've experienced them, you can't know are real, because they aren't, as it were, something that can be measured from the outside. They can only be experienced from the inside. And the more important things in life are of this kind.
For sure. And speaking of things that are experienced from the inside, I'm curious to ask, how did the experience of wrestling with the ideas in the matter with things for, I think you were writing that for more than a decade. How has that changed your subjective experience of being in the world, if at all? Has it changed how you've felt yourself to be in this world as a human being?
Yes, I think it has. It's hard to say for sure because, if you like, my intellectual history, which is something that I have been encouraged to write about, and I'm not sure if I can, but I have made a few starts on it. But anyway, I won't go into that. But is what I want to say is that it's of a piece. So there were various things that I didn't know why I felt them, but I strongly felt them when I was a teenager, that weren't exactly in keeping with the things that I was taught in school. Like this very idea that there is a two-way exchange between the world and myself, that it's not just a passive thing out there, that nature is not passive. Like the fact that uniqueness is at least as important as belonging to a generic group, that the progress of ideas and of civilizations tends to be more spiral-like than following a straight trajectory. That embodiment matters very much, and that context changes everything. And people used to say, so what is this magic something that gets added in when you put the parts together? And at the time I would say, well, you may mock, but I believe there is something. And I mean, I can now give you a philosophical discourse on the subject, which you don't need and I'm not going to give. But what I'm really saying is I already had these inklings, if you like. And then what I've read and what I've experienced, I didn't tell them to go away. I allowed them to sit there and encounter what I learned in different fields, in classics, in the humanities and in science. And so, sorry, this is a very long answer to the question, and I'm not really getting close yet to an answer as to what it is I got that's new out of the process of writing. But in essence, it's seamless. And when did I actually start to write that book? In a way, partly when I was writing The Matter with Things, but more strictly, I did take about a decade over it. And a few things that came out of it are very important. There is a purpose in trying to put into words things that cannot be put into words without enormous difficulty, as long as you recognize that the process is not completely adequate to describing what it is that you want to describe. And so the process of actually I didn't realize at the outset that the book was going to have three parts in the way that it does. One on the neuroscience of the brain, explaining why it is that one hemisphere is much better at picking up information about the nature of the world than the other. And that's important because when we come much later to look at different ways in which the world can be viewed, different philosophical visions, if you like. In the past, we've just had to say, well, some people think like this and some people think like that. But I think now we can say, well, yes, some people thought like that, but we can now see that that's a typical left hemispheric description. And this other one is a more nuanced right hemisphere description. And although it doesn't necessarily prove that the other one is wrong, it suggests which is a better bet to follow. And then, I thought about the different ways in which we can, different paths that we can follow on our road to getting nearer to truth, because we can never get at truth. It's not a thing anyway. It's a process that we get closer to. And that process can be pursued in a number of ways. And effectively, I grew to see how important imagination was and intuition was, alongside the things that I've always championed and continue to champion, which are reason and science. I think that they're under attack in this age from people for political reasons. And I don't think that politics should ever stop us following reason or following the information that science gives us, but they must always also be exercised alongside intuition and imagination. Otherwise, we miss the import of what we're seeing. We misinterpret what we're understanding. And as I say, I had least of all idea of exactly what was going to be going on in that last metaphysical chapter. I knew there'd be something on the the coincidence of opposites and on the one and the many, because I taught about them a lot in writing the Master and His Emissary and well, all my life. I mean, I can remember the moment when I was probably about 15, I suppose, when one of my schoolmates introduced me to Heraclitus. And it really was one of those absolutely life-changing moments. I mean, I just thought, my God, I mean, why are we studying Plato in class? And Plato is fine, and it makes sense, and it doesn't really set me on fire, but the insights of Heraclitus are so profound that although they're paradoxical, something in me immediately resonated with them and didn't go, ah, rubbish. I thought, no, this is a very important, insight. So I knew there would be those, and I knew I wanted to write very much about time, which I think is more important actually than space, although they're both obviously very important. And I needed to be able to work out my ideas about the relationship between matter and consciousness. And I began to see how very much I did believe that consciousness was foundational, and the only rational position to adopt on it is that it is foundational. It is irrational to suppose that it can somehow emerge from something that has nothing to do with consciousness. It's not the kind of thing that is analogous to the wetness of water coming out of the H2O molecule. We can understand how that happens. It can be explained that because of the way the H2O molecules are structured and interact with one another electrophysiologically, then we can understand why they're not electricity, you know what I mean. We understand why the water has the flowing qualities that it has, but this cannot be done for consciousness. And so that had consequences. And then I started this is the big thing that I began to think about much more in the last few years, was the business of values and their nature and the contributions of the two hemispheres to them, and purpose. And why is that important? You said, very much to my pleasure, that when I said that, you found that was inspiring or reassuring or something along those lines. And I'm often asked, so this is all very fascinating about the hemispheres and your analysis of how we got to be where we are, but it's pretty important, isn't it? What are we going to do about it? And I think people can easily become overwhelmed by the thought of the scale of, for example, the ecological crisis that threatens perhaps even our survival, but threatens many forms of life and maybe our way of life as well. And they therefore think, but, I'm so small and the world is so large. Oh no, I just want to cut my throat now. And I think this is very, very sad, because one is given life as a gift and one is never asked to solve all the problems of the world in which one lives. One is asked to live the best human life, to realize the best human life that can, under the circumstances, be realized. And so I sort of usually say, and I said this in a lecture I gave in London on October the 28th, about how we should respond. There are really three levels, if you'll permit me just to say something about them. There's the mega level of join Greenpeace and become an activist and all that, and that's fine, and not everybody can do that, but it has its necessary purpose, and we would be neglecting something if we didn't act at the governmental level to try and reduce and even reverse the damage that we are doing to one another and to nature. And then there's what I'd call the intermediary level, which is something that I was alerted to by my friend Dugald Hine, that's Hine, who has written a very good book called At Work in the Ruins. And the idea of that is we may have to accept at some point we may have to accept it now, that this civilization won't last in its current form. So are we just going to despair, or what are we going to do? And one of the most important things that we could possibly do would be to help model and begin to create small seeds, if you like, of a way of living that can survive and could become a functional way of living when this dysfunctional way of living has finally become impossible. And so I'm very proud to say I'm allied with, although a very inactive, sadly, member of a number of really rather wonderful organizations that are exploring how to change education, how to get people to work together, learning crafts, cultivating food, doing things together and trusting one another and realizing how very fulfilling that is. And if we can seed that around, who knows where that will lead. And at the beginning of our process, it looks very small, but as it grows, it exponentially enlarges. And there becomes this sort of thing, goodness me, where has this come from? So that is a bit of a message of hope. But almost the most hopeful thing of all is you can begin in the inner temple, which is you. You can begin with the one thing that you do have control over, which is what you do, how you think, what you value. And that can be done here and now and doesn't involve persuading other people necessarily. If we start to ensure that at least we are aligning our own lives with the things that are deep and important, then a lot of things will follow instinctively, and they won't need to be formulated in the way that people want me to formulate them. Well, what we should do is we should, change the curriculum, and we should, those things are important. But once you begin to see the world differently, you begin to act differently, to prioritize things differently, and different things follow effortlessly because it is a stream. It's a stream that is currently blocked in us and a stream that can become unblocked. And I really feel that, I'm intensely grateful that what was, I must say, an enormous pain and an enormous task, but was very rewarding of writing this extraordinarily long book, that it did yield for me insight into what is actually there if one just unblocks it and allows it to flow. And that's true of every one of us.
Wow. What a great note to end on. Thank you very much, Iain. The thing that comes to mind for me are probably two things, is that only you could have written that book, right? Only you were uniquely in the position to write that book. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, we spoke before we started recording about, you said you had to write it. You almost felt like there was a demon in you that was possessing you to do it. Like you just, was, and it makes me think they're almost, and again, speculation, of course, but it makes me think there's almost like a creative impulse to this world that we live in. And if we can live our lives the right way and align ourselves with the right values and all the rest, then we become almost like a vessel for that impulse so that can then express ourselves in the world. Does that make sense?
I could have said those very words. I mean, that's exactly how it is. And it really did feel like being ridden by a demon or possessed by a demon of some kind. I mean, a benign but unrelenting demon that wasn't going to take no for an answer, and wasn't going to take my, oh Lord, I just am too tired to do it. No, you're going to get on with it now. And so but no, I think that's it. And the descriptions of so many people, artists, composers, physicists, biologists, would answer to this description, that quite where it came from, they can't say that it was just thought up by them, but the best way of putting it is that they were, yes, the channel, the vessel through which the thing was done, came into being. So there we are. Yeah. That makes perfectly sense, because I think there is a creative impulse, and I think there's a destructive impulse. In a way, Freud and Jung thought the same thing, as that there were impulses like Eros and Thanatos and so on. And I don't think they were wrong. I don't think they were wrong for a minute.
Okay. Well, it's been a fascinating conversation, and thank you very much for your time. For people that want to dive deeper into your work, where can they get the book, and where can they learn more? Is it channelmcgilchrist.com?
I think the best place to start is channelmcgilchrist.com, most of which is accessible to somebody simply on clicking on it and exploring it. It's not necessary to have a membership. If you do want to become a member, there are certain things that you can dive deeper into, but there's an enormous amount of material there that can be explored for nothing. And just look at, there is an awful lot, I'm afraid, of me on YouTube. There we go. And yeah, you can get the book either through the channel, or probably easier through a bookseller. And all good booksellers will have it. And if they won't, tell them and they'll get it.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Iain. I'm looking forward to our next conversation.
Oh, me too, Niall. I've really enjoyed it, and thank you for hosting it.